Today we're bringing us a story about Osiris, the Eternal King. Before we dive into it, kindly like and subscribe to our channel, but only if you enjoy what we do and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now settle in. Whatever weight you carried into this moment, whatever noise followed you through the door, whatever restlessness hums beneath your skin, set it down now gently, the way you would lay a sleeping child into their bed. Just for this little while you do not need to carry any of it. Breathe in slowly. Feel the air move through you like something alive. Now breathe out. Let the day go, let the hours go, let even the sense of time itself soften at the edges. The way the horizon softens when evening arrives over the Nile and the desert sand turns from gold to rose to the deep, hushed violet of dusk. You are here. That is enough. That is everything. I want you to know, before a single word of this story is spoken, that you are seen. The fact that you chose to pause, to sit, to listen, to open yourself to something ancient and luminous, that is not nothing. That is a quiet kind of courage. The world moves so fast now, and the old stories are patient. They have been waiting for a long time. They will wait a little longer still, long enough for you to settle, to breathe, to feel your shoulders drop away from your ears. You are in the right place. Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine, if you will, that you are sitting not in this present age, but on the bank of a great river. The river is wide and dark, and it moves with a slow, enormous confidence, as though it has always known where it is going. Reed grass bends along its edge. Somewhere in the reeds, a bird calls once, and then falls silent. The air smells of water and mud and green growing things. Somewhere behind you, the desert begins, and it stretches all the way to the edge of the known world. Above you, the sky is impossibly large. The stars are not distant tonight. They feel close enough to touch, close enough to call by name, and in this age, in this world, people do call them by name. The stars are gods. The planets are living eyes. The sky is not empty. The sky is full. You are in Egypt, not the Egypt of stone museums and tourist photographs, but the Egypt that breathed, that laughed, that buried its dead with flowers and wept beside the river and told stories through the long, warm nights, because stories were the only thing that made the darkness feel like home. This is the Egypt where Osiris was born. Breathe one more time. Let yourself arrive. And now, my friend, now we begin. Before the world had shape, the primordial waters of Nun. In the beginning there was nothing, but do not mistake nothing for emptiness. The ancient Egyptians, who were among the most precise thinkers the world has ever produced, did not believe that the nothing before creation was a cold and empty void. They believed it was the opposite. They believed it was too full, so achingly full of potential, so dense with what could be, that nothing had yet been able to push its way into being. They called this primordial state the Nun. It was the first and oldest thing. It was the water before water, the darkness before dark, the silence before silence understood itself. The Nun was not a god exactly, though it was sometimes personified as a vast bearded figure immersed in limitless water. The Nun was more like the raw material of existence, the clay from which all clay was made, the story before the story knew it was a story. Within the Nun there was something, a seed, a breath, a trembling. Theologians in Heliopolis, the city of the sun, Egypt's greatest center of learning and sacred thought, described what happened next as the first sunrise. From the depths of the primordial water, a mound of earth emerged. This was the Benben, the first hill, the first land, and standing upon it was Atum, the self-created god, the one who had no father and no mother, the one who simply was because existence insisted on itself. Atum was alone, and aloneness, in the Egyptian understanding, was not a state of peace, but a kind of incompleteness, like a song with only one note. So Atum breathed, and from his own breath he brought forth Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. These were the first children of the first god, and they were also the first pair, the first he and she, the first sense that the world had of its own duality, its own divine dance between opposites. Shu and Tefnut wandered in the darkness of the Nun, and Atum, terrified of losing them in that formless immensity, sent his eye to search for them. When they were found and returned, Atum wept, and from his tears fell the first human beings who were fashioned from that divine sorrow and that divine relief all at once. This is why the Egyptian word for people, remech, sounds something like the word for tears. We are made of a god's weeping. We are made of joy reclaimed. Shu and Tefnut, in time, became parents themselves. They gave birth to two magnificent children, Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. And here we come to one of the most beautiful images in all of ancient religion. Geb and Nut were so deeply in love with each other, so entwined, so inseparable, that in the beginning they lay locked in a permanent embrace, earth pressed against sky, sky pressed against earth, leaving no room between them for anything else to exist. It was Shu, god of air, who separated them. He placed himself between his children, lifting Nut high into the heavens while Geb lay stretched below. And in that separation, in that space between earth and sky, the world as we know it became possible. Birds could fly. Rain could fall. The sun could travel its arc from east to west. Life could breathe. But in that separation there was also grief. Nut arched her body across the heavens, her fingers touching the eastern horizon, her toes touching the western horizon, and she looked down at Geb with an expression that all who looked up at the night sky could recognize. It was the face of a lover separated from their beloved. It was longing made cosmic, and yet even separated, even holding apart, Nut and Geb remained connected. Their union had already taken root. Nut was pregnant, and she carried within her the children who would change everything. The children who would introduce not just life, but story, not just existence, but meaning, into the world. She carried within her the great ones. She carried Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. But this is where the story takes its first turn. The sun god Ra, who had by now emerged as the supreme ruler of the cosmos, brilliant and warm and sovereign over all, heard a prophecy that troubled him deeply. The prophecy said that a child born of Geb and Nut would one day supplant him, would take his throne, would claim his power. And so Ra, in his fear, placed a curse on Nut. She would not be able to give birth on any day of the year. In the Egyptian calendar there were 360 days in a year, and Ra's curse covered all 360 of them. Nut was trapped. The children inside her could not come forth, and she wept, because she could feel them waiting, ready, pressing against the boundaries of the world, yearning to be born. It was Thoth, ibis-headed Thoth, god of wisdom and writing and the moon, the one who loved a good puzzle more than anything, who found a way. Thoth went to Khonsu, the moon god, and challenged him to a game of Senet, the ancient board game that Egyptians played both for pleasure and as a metaphor for the journey of life. They played, and each time Khonsu lost, he paid Thoth in moonlight. By the time the games were done, Thoth had won enough moonlight to construct 5 extra days, days that fell outside the official calendar, days that existed between the years, unclaimed by Ra's curse. These became the epigomenal days, the 5 days upon the year, and in each one Nut was free to give birth. On the first day, Osiris was born, and when he entered the world, a voice rang out across all of creation, not the voice of a human, but the voice of the universe itself, recognizing something that had been waiting to exist. The Lord of all has entered the light. From the very beginning, Osiris was extraordinary. He was not extraordinary in the way of a warrior, though he was described as tall and powerful, his skin the color of new vegetation, as green as the first shoots after the Nile's flood receded, as black as the rich Kemet soil that the flooding left behind. He was extraordinary in a quieter, deeper way. He was extraordinary in the way that a wise man is extraordinary. He looked at the world around him, at the people within it, and he understood what was needed. He understood that what was needed was order, kindness, knowledge. In the earliest versions of his myth, preserved in the pyramid texts, those extraordinary collections of spells and hymns carved into the interior walls of Old Kingdom pyramids, texts so ancient they make Homer seem almost modern. Osiris is already the king. He is already the ruler of the living world, already beloved, already the one around whom all things organize themselves. But the theologians and storytellers of later periods, particularly the priests of the Middle Kingdom and the scholars working under the Ptolemies thousands of years later, wanted to tell more of the story. They wanted to know how Osiris became what he was. They wanted to understand the arc of his life from the beginning, and so they told it like this. When the world was young, when the gods still walked openly among human beings, when the boundary between the sacred and the everyday was thin as morning mist, the world was not yet civilized. Human beings lived like animals. They fought each other. They wandered without purpose. They were lost in their own hungers and fears. They did not know how to grow food. They did not know how to build houses. They did not know how to bury their dead with dignity, or how to pray, or how to order their lives around something larger than survival. Osiris looked at all of this, and he grieved for it. He grieved for it the way a teacher grieves for a student who has gifts they do not yet know how to use. He grieved for it with his whole heart, and then he rolled up the sleeves of his royal robes, and he went to work. He taught humanity to farm. He showed them how to read the flooding of the Nile, how to prepare the soil in the rich black mud it left behind, how to plant emmer wheat and barley, how to tend the grain as it grew, how to harvest it and grind it and make it into bread and beer. These were not small gifts. In ancient Egypt, bread and beer were not simply food and drink. They were civilization itself. They were the proof that human beings could cooperate, that they could plan for the future, that they could take the raw abundance of the natural world and shape it into something sustaining. He taught them to tend the vineyards. He showed them how the grape ripened in the heat of the Egyptian summer, how the juice could be fermented into wine, how wine could be part of celebration and ritual, and the marking of sacred time. He gave them laws. This was perhaps his greatest gift. Laws, not as tools of oppression but as agreements, as the encoded wisdom of a community about how to treat one another. Osiris understood that without law, without some shared framework for navigating disagreement and conflict, human beings would tear each other apart. The law was, in a sense, a kind of love, the love of a society for its own future, the recognition that no one flourishes when everyone fights. He taught them the names of the gods and showed them how to worship. He built the first temples, not as monuments to power, but as meeting places between the human and the divine. He taught the sacred songs and the sacred dances. He showed the people how to make offerings, how to bow their heads in reverence, how to listen for the voice of the sacred in the sound of the wind moving over the water. And then, when Egypt was settled and flourishing, when the people along the Nile were growing crops and building homes and praying in temples and living according to law, Osiris set out to do the same for the rest of the world. He left Egypt in the care of his beloved wife Isis, and we will return to her, because no telling of Osiris is complete without dwelling on Isis, who was in many ways more magnificent than he was, whose love and grief and power would become the engine of the greatest transformation in Egyptian religious history. But for now, Osiris walked and sailed and traveled to every land he could reach. He went east to the lands where the rivers ran swift between steep mountain walls. He went south to the vast savannas where lions watched from their shade with golden eyes. He went north to the shores of the great sea where waves broke white against stone cliffs. And everywhere he went, he did not conquer. He did not come with an army. He came with seeds and songs and stories and laws. He came with his hands open. This is the image of Osiris in his golden age that the Egyptians returned to again and again, that they painted on walls and carved into stone and wove into hymns. A tall, green-skinned king, carrying a crook in one hand and a flail in the other, moving through the world not as a conqueror but as a gardener of human civilization. And at his side, or waiting for his return, was always Isis. If Osiris is the heart of this myth, Isis is its soul. She deserves her own chapter, her own hour, her own epic, and she has received them over and over again for 3,000 years of Egyptian religious history and beyond. But here we must speak of her in the context of Osiris, in the context of the love between them, because that love is not a peripheral detail of this story. That love is the entire point. Isis and Osiris had loved each other, according to the priests of Heliopolis, before they were even born. They had loved each other in the womb of Nut, there in the darkness before birth, curled together in the warmth of their mother's body. This prenatal love was remembered as one of the most tender details of the myth, the idea that some loves are so deep they begin before the world has a chance to separate us, before skin and air and space come between us. When they were born, Osiris on the first day, Isis on the fourth, they recognized each other immediately. As children they were inseparable. As they grew, their love deepened from the closeness of siblings into something richer, the way a seed deepens into a root, the way a root deepens into a tree. In the way of the divine they married. And their marriage was not merely a political alliance or a social contract. It was described as a union of complementary powers, each making the other more fully themselves. Osiris brought strength and law and the patient wisdom of someone who trusts in growth. Isis brought magic and cunning, and the fierce, tireless intelligence of someone who trusts in nothing but her own will. She was the goddess of magic, Isis. Not magic, as we might think of it. Parlor tricks and illusions, but magic as the Egyptians understood it, as Heka, the fundamental force that animates the universe, the power by which the gods shaped reality itself. Isis was the greatest practitioner of Heka who had ever lived. She was cleverer than any other god, more patient, more determined. She was the one who, according to a beautiful side story, had once tricked Ra himself into revealing his secret name, the name by which the universe knew him, the name that contained all his power, by making him old and weak and then offering to cure him only if he spoke that name to her. Ra had wept as he said it, because he knew, even as he said it, what he was giving away. And Isis had listened with the total focused attention of someone who knows they will never hear this again. She was that kind of woman, that kind of goddess. She ruled Egypt wisely in Osiris's absence. She administered the law he had established. She resolved disputes. She protected the borders. She maintained the temples. And she waited for him, not passively, not with the patience of someone who has given up on their own life, but with the active, burning patience of someone who is fully alive in every moment of waiting, who lives each day as though the beloved might return on any tide. When Osiris came home, the Nile flooded with joy. Or so the story tells it. But there were shadows moving at the edges of the Golden Age. There had always been shadows, and one of them wore the face of a brother, Set. Set is one of the most complex figures in all of Egyptian religion, and he deserves to be understood with some care, because this story has often been told as a simple morality tale, the good king versus the evil brother, and that telling does a disservice to the extraordinary nuance of the ancient Egyptian mind. Set was not simply evil. He was dangerous, yes. He was violent, yes. He was associated with the desert, with storms, with the churning red chaos that lurked beyond the black fertile land of the Nile Valley. His animal was something no one has ever quite been able to identify. A creature with a long, rectangular snout and upright, square-tipped ears, a pointed tail, unlike any real animal, a creature of pure mythology that the Egyptians called the Set animal. He was tall and powerful. His hair was red, the color of the desert, the color of blood, the color of the dangerous and uncontrollable. But Set was also a necessary god. He was the one who stood at the prow of Ra's solar boat each night as it traveled through the terrifying underworld, and he was the one who fought off Apophis, the great serpent of chaos, the annihilating darkness that would swallow the sun and end all existence if it was not resisted. Every single night, Set fought Apophis. Every single night, Set held the darkness back. Without Set, there would be no sunrise. Without Set, there would be no world. The Egyptians understood this. They did not simply demonize Set the way later traditions sometimes simplified him. They honored him. They prayed to him. They named their children after him. Some pharaohs, particularly in certain dynasties, were especially devoted to Set and saw him as their patron. Set was the god of the necessary violence that keeps the cosmos alive. He was the god of the desert that surrounded Egypt and made it defensible. He was the god of the storm that could destroy crops, but also broke the heat and brought the rain. He was not evil. He was excessive. He was uncontrolled. He was the version of strength that has no wisdom to guide it, the version of power that has no love to govern it. And Set wanted the throne of Egypt. He had always wanted it. He had watched Osiris, golden and beloved, teaching the world and being praised by everyone, and something in Set had curdled. Whether it was envy or a genuine belief that he was more suited to rule, the texts do not quite agree. But the feeling grew in him like a stone growing in the chest, harder and colder and more solid with each passing year. He began to plan. The manner of Osiris's death, if death is even the right word for what happened, is one of the most dramatic and emotionally resonant moments in all of world mythology. Set ordered a beautiful chest to be built. He had it constructed to the precise measurements of Osiris's body. Measured, it is thought, in secret. Perhaps by servants who could be bought. Perhaps by Set himself, who knew his brother's form as only a sibling can know it. The chest was inlaid with gold and ivory and the most precious stones of Egypt. It was, by every account, the most beautiful chest anyone had ever seen. Then Set organized a great feast. It was a celebration, he said, a gathering of the gods and the great ones of Egypt. And Osiris came, because Osiris trusted his brother, or perhaps because Osiris was the kind of person who could not imagine the depth of betrayal that Set had prepared. The feast was magnificent. The food was abundant. Wine flowed from tall jars painted with lotuses and papyrus. Music was played on harps and sistrums, those rattling sacred instruments whose sound the Egyptians believed kept evil spirits at bay. Everyone was at ease, laughing, sprawling on their cushions, turning their faces to one another with the open warmth of people who believe they are among friends. At the height of the evening, Set called for quiet. He gestured to the chest, that beautiful, gleaming, extraordinary chest, and he proposed a game. Whoever fit perfectly inside the chest, he said, could keep it. It was a gift, freely given, to whoever it belonged to by the evidence of their own body. One by one, the guests tried. Some were too short, some too wide, some too tall. Some laughed as they climbed in and found themselves awkward and climbed back out. It was a party game, and it had the light, festive energy of a party game, and no one thought very much about it. Until Osiris tried. He laid himself down in the chest. He settled into it. And the chest fit him perfectly, because of course it did, because it had been made for him and him alone, measured to the contour of his body, built for this exact moment. He lay there, perhaps for the space of a breath, in the warmth and luxury of the inlaid wood, in the middle of the feast, surrounded by the sounds of laughter and music. And then Set and his conspirators, 72 of them, according to some tellings, men who had pledged themselves to him, men who wanted the power that would flow from Set's kingship, fell upon the chest. They slammed the lid shut. They sealed it with lead, pouring the molten metal into the seams so that no air could pass in or out. Osiris was trapped, sealed in darkness, sealed in the beautiful chest that had been built as his prison and his tomb. And then they carried the chest to the Nile. They threw it in. The river took it. The river that Osiris had loved, that he had taught people to read and reverence, that ran through the heart of the civilization he had built. That river carried him away. Set took the throne of Egypt. When Isis heard what had happened, she did not collapse. She might have been expected to. The loss was enormous, the loss of her husband, her beloved, the man she had known before her own birth, the man with whom she had shared the warmth of their mother's body, the man for whom she had governed Egypt in faithful solitude during his long journeys. The loss was the kind that should have leveled her. Instead, Isis shaved her head, the sign of mourning, the sign of a woman undone, and then she set out to find him. She walked barefoot through Egypt, asking everyone she met if they had seen the chest. She disguised herself as a wandering woman, unremarkable, anonymous, so that Set's spies would not recognize her and bring word back to him. She moved through villages and temples and harbors, and everywhere she went she asked, "Have you seen it? Have you seen a chest, a beautiful chest, sealed with lead, floating on the water?" Children were often the ones who helped her. The Egyptians loved this detail, the idea that children, who are honest and unguarded, who have not yet learned to calculate the political cost of every word, were the ones who told Isis the truth when adults would not. Children told her which direction the chest had gone, whispered to her in doorways, and at the edges of the river while their parents looked nervously over their shoulders. The chest had not stayed in Egypt. The Nile had carried it north, to the sea, and the sea had carried it east, and the east wind had carried it to the shores of Byblos, in what is now Lebanon, a great Phoenician city of cedar and trade and the smell of the sea. And at Byblos, something remarkable had happened. The chest, drifting on the shore, had come to rest against a tamarisk tree. And the tree, feeling the divine presence within the chest, feeling the life force of Osiris even in his sealed and airless prison, had embraced it. The tree had grown around the chest, wrapping it in wood, incorporating it into its own body, until the chest was entirely hidden within the trunk of a great and beautiful tamarisk. The king of Byblos, passing by, had seen the tree and been amazed by it. It was the most beautiful tree anyone had ever seen. It smelled of something extraordinary, some perfume that was not quite of this world, that was sweet and deep and made people want to stand near it and simply breathe. The king had ordered the tree cut down and brought to his palace, where it was fashioned into a pillar, a central supporting pillar for the roof of the great hall, a column of honor around which the life of the court revolved. And so Osiris lay, sealed in his chest, sealed inside the tamarisk, now sealed inside the pillar at the heart of the palace of Byblos, waiting, sustained by something the texts never quite name, perhaps by Isis's love, which was strong enough to reach across the sea, perhaps by his own divine nature, which even death could not fully extinguish, perhaps by the tamarisk tree's embrace, that green and living tenderness. Isis arrived at Byblos. She sat down by the well outside the palace walls, and she waited. The queen's handmaidens came to draw water, and Isis was there, and they looked at her curiously. This woman with the shaved head and the bare feet, clearly a woman in mourning, clearly a woman who had walked a long way. Isis braided their hair. She spoke to them gently and wisely. She breathed on them, and from her breath came a fragrance so beautiful, so unearthly, that when the handmaidens returned to the palace, the queen noticed immediately. She summoned this strange woman. Isis came to the palace, and the queen, Astarte in some versions, Athenais in others, took her immediately into service because there was something about Isis that made people want to trust her, made people want to keep her close. Isis became the nurse to the queen's youngest child, her infant son. And here the story takes another of its breathtaking turns. Every night, after the palace was asleep, Isis would take the infant and hold him over the flame of a great lamp. She was burning away his mortality, giving him the gift of eternal life, the way a skilled goldsmith burns away impurities to reveal the pure gold beneath. The child did not cry. He was not harmed. He lay in the fire and was transformed. But one night the queen came in and saw her child in the flames. She screamed. And Isis, startled out of her ritual, could not complete it. The boy would live a full human life. She gave him that, but he would not be immortal. The chance was broken. Isis, her composure perhaps cracking slightly at the edges, revealed herself. She stood in the palace of Byblos in her full divine form, and the room became bright, and the queen fell to her knees, and the court fell to their knees, and even the palace itself seemed to bow. Isis asked for the pillar. The king gave it to her without question. What else could he do? He gave her the pillar, and Isis took it outside, and she broke it open herself. Not with a tool, but with her hands, her divine hands tearing open the wood with a grief, and a love so intense they became the same thing. She found the chest within the trunk. She found Osiris within the chest. She pressed her face against the sealed lid and wept. Her tears, the old texts say, fell on the floor of Byblos and made it holy, and the spot was venerated for thousands of years afterward. She brought him home to Egypt. Isis brought the chest back to Egypt by night, navigating by starlight, her power wrapped around her like a cloak. She hid it in the papyrus marshes of the delta, those dense, secretive wetlands in the north of Egypt, where the Nile braided itself into dozens of channels, and the reed beds grew so thick that a person could vanish in them for years. She left the chest there, only briefly. Perhaps she needed to rest. Perhaps she needed to find Nephthys, her sister, who had also been weeping and searching, who was caught in her own complicated anguish, married to Set, but in love with the memory of Osiris, torn between her loyalty and her grief. Set found it. Set went hunting in the delta at night. The old texts say he was hunting by moonlight, which in some versions gives the scene an almost dreamlike quality. The great red-haired god moving through the silver-lit marshes with his hunters, and then stopping, and then recognizing. He found the chest. And Set, who was not a god given to half measures, did what he did with a terrible thoroughness. He tore the body of Osiris into pieces. Some texts say 14 pieces. Some say 42, one for each of the nomes, the administrative districts of Egypt, as if the land itself had been written on his body. He scattered the pieces across Egypt, one piece here, one piece there, in the river, in the desert, in distant oases, at the edges of the known world. He thought that if the body was scattered, it could not be restored. He thought that if there was no body, Isis's grief would have nowhere to go, would simply disperse like water in sand, and she would give up, and Set would be secure on his throne forever. He was wrong about Isis. Isis and Nephthys find the broken king. The second search of Isis is the portion of this myth that reached deepest into the hearts of ordinary Egyptians for 3,000 years of civilization. It became a sacred text. Priests read it aloud at funerals. Women wailed it at burials, their arms raised, their hair unbound, performing the eternal grief of the goddess as a way of honoring their own grief, of making their personal loss part of something cosmic and therefore survivable. Because Isis searched again. She did not collapse, she did not give up. She was a mother by now. She had conceived a child with Osiris during that brief reunion in the marshes, hovering over him in the form of a kite, a hawk, a bird of prey, drawing life from him even in his sealed sleep. She was carrying within her the child who would one day avenge his father. She was carrying Horus. But she searched. She and Nephthys searched together. Nephthys, the quiet, shadowed sister, the underworld twin of Isis, the one who was present at death as Isis was present at birth. Together they moved through Egypt like two women who would not rest. Two women who understood that love is not a feeling you have when things are easy, but a commitment you keep when everything is falling apart. One by one, they found the pieces. The texts describe this with a quiet, painstaking specificity. Here, in the shallows of a papyrus marsh, they found a portion of the sacred body. Here, at the edge of a desert where jackals had been circling, they found another. Here, at the base of a date palm, where a local legend had always claimed something sacred was buried. Here, in the water itself, carried by the current to a gentle curve of the bank. Anubis was with them. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, the lord of embalming, the protector of the dead. He is described in some versions as the son of Osiris and Nephthys, conceived in a complicated tangle of grief and love and transgression that the Egyptians did not shy away from acknowledging. Anubis knew the art of preserving the dead, of wrapping the body, of keeping it safe from corruption. He had been waiting, in some sense, his whole existence for this moment. He guided them. He helped them find the pieces. And when all were found, all but one, according to the most common version of the myth, one piece that had fallen into the Nile and been swallowed by a fish, a catfish or a crab depending on the telling, and could not be recovered. Anubis began the work. He laid out the pieces of Osiris on a clean white linen cloth. He brought them together. He bound them with bandages of fine linen. He anointed the body with sacred oils, cedar oil and myrrh and natron, substances that had been used to embalm the dead in Egypt since before recorded history. He wrapped the body in the wrappings of the mummy, those careful, intimate bandages that have become one of the most recognizable images of ancient Egypt, and which every Egyptian pharaoh and every Egyptian noble aspired to receive in their own death. He was making Osiris into the first mummy. He was inventing death, not destroying it, not denying it, but giving it a shape, a dignity, a ritual. He was saying to all of Egypt and all the world, the body matters, the dead matter. The love we give to those who have left us is not wasted. It is the most important work we will ever do. Isis stood over the restored body. She spread her great wings, because this is one of her transformations, her form as a bird, as a great hawk or a kite, wings wide as the sky, capable of stirring the air with a downdraft powerful enough to breathe life back into the dead, and she beat her wings over Osiris. And the sacred breath entered him, and he breathed. Not the way he had breathed in life, not with the full, easy breath of someone walking through a summer field or sitting at a feast or teaching a child to plant wheat. But he breathed. He came back to a kind of life, a liminal life, a life between worlds, a life that was no longer quite the same as the living but was not yet the fully dead. He looked at Isis. She looked at him. There are no words in the texts for what passed between them. There are only images. The hawk wings, the white bandages, the linen cloth, the lamplight, the desert silence. He returned to her fully enough to conceive their child. He returned to her fully enough for one last night. And then Osiris went, gently and with full knowledge of where he was going, into the west, into the Duat, into the realm of the dead. He became its king. The Egyptian understanding of the afterlife is one of the most sophisticated and psychologically rich systems of thought about death that human beings have ever developed, and at its center is Osiris. The Duat, sometimes translated as the underworld, though that word carries connotations of punishment and darkness that don't fully capture the Egyptian vision, was not primarily a place of horror. It was a place of transformation. It was described as beautiful in its own dark way, as having its own geography, rivers and mountains and cities, orchards of fruit trees and fields of grain, all of it lit by the traveling sun that passed through it each night on its way from west to east. It was also a place of accountability. Here we come to one of the most magnificent inventions in all of human religious thought, the weighing of the heart. When a person died, the ancient Egyptians believed the soul entered the hall of two truths, the great judgment hall of the Duat, presided over by Osiris himself. The soul stood before 42 divine assessors, 42 judges representing every crime, every failure, every betrayal that a human being might have committed. And the soul spoke the negative confession, a declaration of innocence, a statement of what they had not done. I have not lied. I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not cheated the poor of their portions. I have not dishonored the gods. I have not mistreated animals. I have not made anyone weep without cause. These were not arbitrary rules. They were the distillation of what the Egyptians meant by Ma'at, the divine principle of truth, justice, harmony, and balance. Ma'at was itself a goddess, and her symbol was the feather, the lightest thing in the world, the thing that the hieroglyphs used to write her name. After the negative confession, the heart of the dead person, understood as the seat of the soul, the record of every thought and deed and feeling across a lifetime, was placed on one side of a great scale. On the other side was the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was light, if a life had been lived with integrity, with kindness, with a genuine attempt at truth and justice, the scales balanced. The feather and the heart were equals. The soul was declared worthy and went on into the paradise of the field of reeds, where the sun always shone, and the grain always grew, and the beloved dead could be met again. If the heart was heavy, if it was weighed down by guilt and cruelty and willful harm, the scales tipped. And beside the scales waited the devourer, Ammit, one of the strangest creatures in Egyptian mythology, with the head of a crocodile, the 4 quarters of a lion, and the hind quarters of a hippopotamus, The three most dangerous animals of Egypt united in one ravenous form. Ammit swallowed the heavy hearts, and when a heart was swallowed by Ammit, there was no second life, no paradise, no continuity. The soul simply ceased to exist. The Egyptians called this the second death. They were more afraid of it than they were of dying. Osiris presided over all of this. He sat on his throne in the Hall of Two Truths, wrapped in the white bandages of the mummy, holding the crook and the flail, the same crook and flail he had carried when he walked among the living as king. His skin was the green of resurrection, the green of grain pushing through dark soil, the green of the lotus rising from the water. His crown was white, flanked by great ostrich feathers and the horns of a ram. Beside him stood Isis and Nephthys, his eternal guardians, their arms outstretched in the gesture of protection. He was the judge, but he was not a cold or merciless judge. He was a judge who had suffered. He was a judge who knew what it was to be betrayed, to be murdered, to be scattered across the world and gathered back together piece by the love of a woman who refused to stop searching. He was a judge who had been through the worst that existence could offer, and who had come out the other side not hardened, but deepened. This is what made the Egyptians love him, not his power, not his beauty, not even his kingship. They loved him because he had suffered and endured. They loved him because when he looked at their hearts on the scales, he knew. He knew what it was to be human, to be fragile, to make mistakes, to be broken and put back together imperfectly. He knew what it was to love and lose. He knew what it was to lie in the dark with no air, waiting for rescue that you could not be sure would ever come. He was not a god who had only ever lived in glory. He was a god who had been in the chest. While Osiris sat in his kingdom below, the battle for the world above was not over. Isis, alone in the papyrus marshes of the delta, gave birth to her son. She named him Horus, the distant one, the falcon, the god of the sky itself. His eyes were the sun and the moon. His outstretched wings were the horizon. He was the heir of Osiris, the legitimate king of Egypt, and from the moment of his birth he was also a hunted child, because Set knew he existed, and Set knew what his existence meant. Isis raised Horus in secret. She wrapped him in the reeds and the rushes. She bent the papyrus over him like a green curtain. She fed him from herself. She sang to him the songs of Egypt, the songs his father had taught the world, and she told him stories. She told him the story of his father, over and over from the beginning, so that he would know who he was and why his life mattered and what he was being shaped for. Horus grew quickly, as divine children do, and the growing was not easy. He was stung by scorpions sent by Set. Isis, frantic, invoked the power of Ra to stop the sun in its course, long enough for her to recite the healing spells that saved her son's life. He recovered. He was bitten by serpents. He recovered. He was struck by diseases the desert sent against him. He recovered. Each time the texts say, Isis healed him. But what they are really saying, in the way that myth says things, is that love kept him alive, that a mother's refusal to give up on a child is itself a kind of magic, indistinguishable from any power the gods possess. When Horus was grown, when he stood in his full divine power, the falcon god, golden and fierce and burning with righteous purpose, he challenged Set for the throne of Egypt. The war that followed lasted, depending on which texts you consult, either 80 years or much longer. It was a war that took many forms. Physical combat between two divine beings of almost equal power, legal battles before the tribunal of the gods, with Thoth recording the arguments and Isis speaking on behalf of her son, a series of trials and contests that the gods devised to determine who was the rightful ruler. The combat between Horus and Set was violent and terrible, and both of them bore wounds. Set tore out Horus's left eye, the moon eye, the one that measured the cycles of time, and Horus tore away Set's testicles. These are not sanitized myths. These are stories that looked at the cost of conflict with unflinching eyes, that said yes, even the battle between justice and chaos leaves both sides bleeding. The eye of Horus, the Wedjat, the healed eye, the eye that Thoth or Hathor restored, became one of the most powerful symbols in all of Egyptian magic and medicine. It was painted on amulets and carved on coffins and drawn on papyrus as a sign of protection and healing and the power of restoration. Every Egyptian wore it or carried it or prayed over it at some point in their life. It said, "What was broken can be whole again. What was taken can be restored. Loss is not the final word. The tribunal of the gods was contentious." The older gods, led by the ancient god Thoth, tended to support Horus. But Ra, who had always had a complicated relationship with Set, recognizing his necessity even while acknowledging his excess, wavered and delayed. Osiris himself intervened from the underworld, sending a letter to the divine tribunal that combined the authority of a king with the raw, unmistakable voice of a father. "My son is the legitimate heir. My throne is his by right of blood and law and the will of Mut. Grant him what is his or answer to me. And consider, I have the power of death in my hands. I can send the emissaries of the underworld to collect any soul I choose." It was, as messages from the dead go, reasonably persuasive. Horus was declared the victor. He was crowned king of the living world, the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, united under the falcon crown. He took his father's place on the earthly throne, completing the cycle, healing the wound that Set's betrayal had opened. Set was not destroyed. Even here the Egyptians showed their characteristic theological sophistication. Set was given a place. He was sent to the sky, to thunder, to the storms of the horizon. Some versions say he was taken onto Ra's solar boat, to fight Apophis eternally. His energy, his terrible power, was redirected rather than eliminated. Because the Egyptians understood that chaos cannot be destroyed, it can only be contained, channeled, given a purpose larger than itself. And Horus, taking the throne, became not just a king but an archetype. Every pharaoh who ruled Egypt from that day forward was understood to be Horus incarnate. Every pharaoh was the living Horus, the son of Osiris, the falcon on the throne. And when every pharaoh died, they became Osiris. They passed from the living world to the kingdom of the dead, where they joined the great king in the field of reeds, in the hall of two truths, in the eternal west. This was not merely a theological conceit. It was the organizing principle of Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. For most of the Old Kingdom, the age of the great pyramid builders, the age of Khufu and Khafre and Menkaure, the age when the Giza Plateau was transformed from desert to monument, the afterlife and all its protections were the exclusive possession of the pharaoh. The pyramid texts, those oldest of religious writings, were carved only in royal tombs. The spells and hymns and magic words that could guide a soul through the Duat, that could ensure the heart would balance on the scales, that could navigate the 42 judges and the crocodiles and the fire-breathing gatekeepers of the underworld. These were pharaohs alone. But Egypt changed. The Old Kingdom collapsed around 2180 BCE, in a period of drought and famine and civil war and fragmentation that Egyptians remembered afterward with horror and grief. The central authority of the pharaoh was shattered. Power devolved to the provincial governors, the nomarchs, the local rulers. And in that fragmentation, something remarkable happened. The afterlife began to democratize. The nobles took the pyramid texts and adapted them, inscribed versions on the walls of their own coffins, claimed for themselves the spells and the protections that had once belonged only to the king. These became the Coffin Texts, and in the Middle Kingdom that followed, as Egypt reassembled itself and grew strong again, the Coffin Texts spread further still. By the New Kingdom, the age of Ramesses and Tutankhamun and Akhenaten, the age of Egypt's greatest power and most far-flung empire, the spells had become the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which later translators would call the Book of the Dead. These papyrus scrolls were commissioned by private individuals, by merchants and scribes and soldiers and priests, by anyone who could afford to have a scribe write out the spells and an artist illustrate them with the vivid, beautiful imagery of the judgment hall and the field of reeds and the great scale with its feather. The Book of the Dead is an extraordinary document. It is, in one sense, a practical guidebook to the afterlife. Here is the spell to say at each gate. Here is the prayer to speak before each divine assessor. Here is the ritual formula that will ensure your heart is light. It is a map and a prayer and a liturgy all at once. But in another, deeper sense, it is a meditation on what it means to live well, because the spells are only useful to someone who has actually lived by the principles they describe. You cannot merely recite the negative confession and expect to be believed. The 42 judges and the scale of Ma'at are not interested in your words. They are interested in what your heart remembers. The heart holds the truth that the tongue might hide. The heart is the evidence. This is the profound ethical vision at the heart of Osirian religion, that the quality of your life matters, and that death is the moment when that truth is seen clearly for what it is, not as punishment and not as reward, but simply as revelation. The weighing of the heart is not a trial by an angry god. It is a mirror. Osiris, presiding over it, is the most humane judge the ancient world could imagine, because he has been both the dead man and the living man. He has been the king who made the laws and the broken body scattered across the land. He has been the one who needed to be found and the one who found his way back. He has looked at his own heart and known its weight. When all of Egypt became one story, the myth of Osiris was not merely a story told in temples by priests to initiates. It was a public event. It was the occasion for some of the most emotionally powerful and widely attended religious celebrations in the ancient world. The Abydos festival was perhaps the most famous. Abydos, in Upper Egypt, was the place most associated with Osiris. It was believed to be where his head, or his body, or some essential part of him had been found by Isis. It was the holiest site in Egypt. To die near Abydos, or to be buried near it, or at the very least, to have your name inscribed on a stele near the processional route, was one of the great aspirations of every Egyptian's life. During the month of Khoiak, which fell in what we would call autumn, the festival of Osiris was held, and it was not a quiet, cerebral religious observation. It was theatre. It was communal performance. It was the entire myth, enacted in public, spread across days. The sacred bark of Osiris, a gilded boat carrying the god's cult statue, was carried in procession out of the temple. The crowd that gathered was enormous, coming from every part of Egypt, pilgrims who had walked for days, or travelled by riverboat to be there. As the procession moved, it was attacked. Priests wearing the masks of Set's followers, performers enacting the murder, the betrayal, the chaos that had been unleashed on the world. And the crowd mourned. They wailed aloud, the women tearing at their hair and raising their arms in the gesture that every Egyptian knew from tomb paintings, the gesture of grief, the posture of Isis and Nephthys flanking the mummy. They wept real tears. These were not actors playing grief. These were people who had lost fathers and mothers and children and spouses, people who had buried beloved faces in the black Egyptian earth and who found in the story of Osiris a framework for their grief that made it bearable. They wept for him, and they wept for everyone they had ever lost, and the weeping was holy. Then the battle, the combat of Horus and Set, performed with a physicality that the ancient sources say was sometimes very real, with shouts and the crack of wooden weapons. The crowd chose sides. They called out for Horus, they hissed at Set. They groaned when Horus was struck and cheered when he landed a blow. And then the resurrection, the restoration, the announcement that Osiris lived, not as he had lived before, but as something greater, as the King of Eternity, as the Lord of the Dead who had conquered death by going through it. The cult statue was returned to its inner sanctuary. The priests emerged to announce the news, and the crowd erupted, not in the way of people who are surprised, but in the way of people who have been holding their breath through the known story, who cannot stop themselves from cheering even though they know perfectly well how it ends. Because that is the magic of story. We can know the ending and still be moved by it. We can have heard it 100 times and still feel our hearts lift when Osiris breathes again. We can carry the grief of all our losses into the festival and find, in the ritual enactment of loss and recovery, something that makes our grief feel integrated into a larger pattern, a cosmic rhythm of loss and return, death and resurrection, the sun going down and the sun coming up. This is what Osiris gave to Egypt. Not just a theology of the afterlife, but a way of living with loss that did not require denying it. There is another dimension to Osiris that is easy to miss if we focus only on the drama of the myth, his role as a nature deity, as a god of vegetation, as the force within the land itself that made things grow. The Egyptians identified Osiris with the Nile flood. Each year, predictably, gloriously, the Nile rose. It flooded the banks, spreading the black silt across the fields, renewing the land, depositing the fertility that made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world. And then it receded, and in its wake the farmers planted, and the grain grew, and Egypt ate. The flooding of the Nile was Osiris. The grain that grew from the black earth was Osiris. The bread that was baked from the grain was Osiris. Every time an Egyptian ate bread, which was every day, at every meal, from the pharaoh to the lowest laborer, they were, in a sense, consuming the god. They were taking his life into their bodies. They were being sustained by his death and rebirth. This is a profound idea. It is the idea that the earth's fertility is not simply a natural phenomenon, but a sacred gift, that the cycle of planting and harvest is itself a religious act, that every meal is a kind of communion with something larger than hunger and nourishment. The grain of Osiris. This was the phrase. Small figurines were made of mud mixed with grain seeds, shaped into the form of Osiris, and watered until the seeds germinated and the green shoots pushed up through the dark earth. These were placed in tombs. Osiris beds, they are called, and examples have been found in tombs across Egypt, from the humblest burials to the most elaborate royal interments. They were the promise of renewal. They were the proof, given by the earth itself, that life came from death, that the seed had to go into the dark before it could push back into the light. Every spring, when the fields of Egypt were green with new grain, every farmer looked at that greenness and recognized it. This was the color of Osiris. This was the god, living in the land, doing what he had always done, teaching the world to grow. One of the most remarkable facts about Osiris is how far he traveled. He had always been, in the myth, the god who set out to civilize the world, who carried his gifts beyond the borders of Egypt to every nation he could reach. And in a profound historical irony, the myth itself did the same thing. By the time of the New Kingdom, Egyptian influence had spread across the Mediterranean world, and the story of Osiris had begun to infiltrate other cultures. Greek travelers came to Egypt and were astonished by what they found. A civilization of such extraordinary age and sophistication that it made their own history seem brief. They came as students and tourists and merchants, and they came away carrying stories. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, composed one of the most complete non-Egyptian accounts of the Osiris myth, a work called Deicide et Osiride, concerning Isis and Osiris. His version is the one that most people who know the myth at all have encountered, because it synthesized the various Egyptian versions into a flowing narrative that Greek and Roman readers could follow. He was not entirely accurate. He filtered the story through a Platonic lens, seeing Osiris as an embodiment of good and Set as an embodiment of evil in a way that oversimplified the Egyptian originals. But he was genuinely reverent. He understood that he was in the presence of something ancient and serious. The cult of Isis and Osiris spread through the Greco-Roman world in the Hellenistic and Roman periods with a speed and fervor that surprised even the Romans, who were generally comfortable with absorbing foreign gods. Temples to Isis were built in Rome, in Greece, in the Rhine Valley, in Britain. The mystery cult of Isis, offering its initiates secret knowledge of death and rebirth, secret participation in the eternal drama of loss and restoration, attracted followers from every walk of Roman life, from slaves to senators. What were people looking for in this Egyptian god? The same things, it seems, that the Egyptians themselves had always found in him. A god who had suffered. A god who knew what it was to be mortal, to be betrayed, to be broken and put back together. A god whose judgment was tempered by experience rather than divine distance. A god whose death was meaningful, whose resurrection was not a miracle that made suffering irrelevant, but a transformation that made suffering endurable. And underneath all of that, the feather of Mart on the scales. The idea that how you live matters. The idea that the dead are not merely gone, but are present in a kingdom that borders ours, that can be reached by love and memory and the proper observance of ritual, that cares about what happens among the living. No discussion of the legacy of Osiris can avoid the question that has fascinated scholars, theologians, and religious historians for generations. The relationship between the myth of Osiris and the central narrative of Christianity, a dying and rising god, a divine son born of a miraculous conception, a mother's grief and a father's resurrection, judgment of the dead, a kingdom of the afterlife presided over by the divine king who went through death and came out the other side. Bread and wine as the body of the god. The parallels are striking, and they have been noted since at least the 2nd century CE, when early Christian writers encountering the cult of Osiris in Egypt sometimes dismissed the similarities as demonic imitation and sometimes quietly absorbed them. The truth of the relationship between these traditions is complex, and serious scholars are careful about it. Influence is not identity. The Egyptian myth is ancient and multifaceted and rooted in a very specific cultural and ecological context. The Nile, the flood, the Black Earth, the structure of Egyptian kingship. Christianity emerged from a very different context. Second Temple Judaism, the Roman Empire, the specific history and theology of a particular people. The similarities, real as they are, coexist with profound differences. What we can say with confidence is this: the Egyptian story of Osiris was part of the cultural atmosphere of the ancient Mediterranean world in which Christianity was born and grew. It was one strand in the larger conversation that humanity was having, across many languages and many traditions, about the same deep questions: what happens after we die? Does our life matter? Is there justice in the universe? Can love survive death? These questions are not Egyptian questions, or Jewish questions, or Greek questions. They are human questions, and every tradition that has tried to answer them, however differently, is part of the same enormous, unfinished story. Osiris was one of the first to try. He tried with such beauty and depth that his answer lasted 3,000 years in the culture that created it, and sent echoes into every culture that came after. Osiris is not gone. He sits in museums, of course, in the galleries of the Egyptian collections in Cairo and London and Paris and New York, surrounded by tourists and scholars and children on school trips who press their faces against the glass and look at the bandaged, green-skinned figure with the crook and the flail, and feel something they cannot quite name. Something old and serious. Something that knows things. He lives in literature. Writers from every era of the Western tradition have returned to the story. T.S. Eliot's great poem, The Wasteland, braids Osirian imagery through its meditation on a world that has lost its fertility myths and does not know how to mourn. James Fraser's The Golden Bough, that enormous Victorian synthesis of world mythology, placed Osiris at the center of a global pattern of dying and rising gods, vegetation deities, sacred kings whose deaths were necessary for the renewal of the land. Whether or not Fraser's framework holds up to modern scholarly scrutiny, and it has been substantially challenged, his work ensured that Osiris remained in the cultural conversation. He lives in psychology. Carl Jung, who spent years analyzing the mythological images that appeared in his patients' dreams and in world literature, identified in the myth of Osiris patterns that he believed were universal. The dismemberment of the self, the search and recovery by the feminine principle, the descent into the underworld as a necessary journey before any genuine transformation could occur. Whether or not Jung's specific theoretical framework is accepted, his basic intuition seems borne out by the frequency with which the story resonates. People who encounter it for the first time, regardless of their background or beliefs, often feel that it is describing something they know. He lives in the way we think about death. The Egyptian approach to death. The insistence that the dead matter, that how we treat our dead is a measure of who we are, that love does not end at the moment of last breath, has been one of the most influential ideas in human history. Every culture that treats its dead with ceremony, that buries its loved ones with care, that keeps the names of the dead alive in speech and in prayer and in story, is, in some sense, continuing the work that Isis began in the papyrus marshes, that Anubis perfected in the wrapping of the first mummy, that Osiris embodied by becoming the judge who had himself been judged by the deepest experiences of mortality. We still weigh hearts, not literally, not on golden scales in a judgment hall with a jackal-headed god attending, but we still ask, did this person live well? Did they do more good than harm? Were they kind in the end? Did they try? These are the questions we ask at funerals and memorial services, and in the quiet, private moments when someone we loved has died, and we are trying to hold their whole life in our hands and understand its shape. These are the questions of the scale of Maat. We have traveled far together, you and I, from the Nun, from the first breath of Atum on the Benben mound, through the golden age of civilization, through the feast and the chest and the night on the river, through the grief of Isis and the search, through the marshes and the palace of Abydos, through the dismemberment and the gathering of pieces, through the judgment hall and the field of reeds and the war of Horus and the long centuries of festival and prayer. We have been in Egypt. We have been in the oldest part of the human story, and now, as the telling comes to its end, let us sit for a moment with what we have received. The story of Osiris is, at its deepest level, a story about transformation. Not the cheap kind of transformation that promises you can skip the hard parts. Not the kind of transformation that says, suffer briefly, and then everything will be better, and the suffering will seem like nothing in retrospect. The Egyptian mind was too honest for that. The suffering in this story is real, and it is permanent. Osiris does not come back to life in exactly the form he had before. He does not walk out of the Duat and sit back down on the earthly throne and continue his teaching and his kingship as though nothing happened. He becomes something different, something that could only have been forged in the experience he went through. The green god who walked the living world, teaching people to farm and pray and live by law. That Osiris was good. He was magnificent. He was the best kind of king. But the Osiris who sits in the hall of two truths, who looks at the hearts of the dead and weighs them against the feather, who has been through dismemberment and darkness and restoration, that Osiris is deeper. He knows things the earlier version of himself could not have known. This is what the Egyptians were saying with this myth. They were saying, the things that break you change you, and the change is not always worse than what you were before. Sometimes it is better, if you survive it. If there are people who love you enough to search for the pieces, if you allow yourself to be reassembled. They were also saying something about love. The love of Isis for Osiris is, in the Egyptian understanding, not a human-scale love. It is a cosmic force. It is the thing that holds the world together, that refuses to accept the permanence of loss, that will walk barefoot from one end of the earth to the other and beat its wings over the sealed chest and call the dead back to something like life. It is a love that does not require its object to be unchanged, that can love the mummy-bandaged, reconstituted, underworld-dwelling version of its beloved just as fiercely as it loved the Golden King. That love is not lost on us. We recognize it. We recognize it in every person who has sat beside a hospital bed, or read aloud to someone who cannot respond, or tended a grave with flowers year after year, or spoken a beloved name into an empty room, because speaking it keeps something alive that silence would extinguish. We are all, in our small human ways, looking for the pieces of what we have lost, and the story of Osiris tells us, keep looking. They are findable. They are scattered, yes. They are scattered across a great distance, and one piece may be unrecoverable, but the rest are there. The rest can be gathered. The rest can be wrapped in love and breathed into, and made whole enough to matter. One final thing, before we rest. The Egyptians looked up at the night sky, the way we have mostly stopped looking, with full attention, with a sense of participation, rather than mere observation. The stars were not decorations on a velvet backdrop. They were living presences. They were gods. Osiris was Orion, that great constellation that dominates the winter sky. Those 3 stars in a perfect line that form his belt. The bright stars above that form his shoulders. The stars below that form his feet. That was Osiris. Sa, the Egyptians called it. Sa, the Great One. The one who walks the sky with his 3-starred belt, eternal and unreachable. And beside him, slightly ahead of him in the turning of the celestial sphere, was Isis, Sopdet, the brilliant star we call Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, the one that the Egyptians used to predict the annual flooding of the Nile, because Sirius rose in the pre-dawn sky just before the flood came each year. They walk together still, Osiris and Isis. Every winter night, when the sky is clear and cold, you can look up and find them. The great striding figure of Orion, with his unmistakable belt, and ahead of him the blazing point of Sirius, moving through the sky as she moved through the world, always just ahead, always searching, always brilliant. The ancient Egyptians saw this. They stood in their fields and their courtyards and on the rooftops of their temples, and they looked up at those stars, and they knew they were looking at a story. They were looking at love that had outlasted death. They were looking at a king who had been broken and remade. They were looking at the universe's own testimony that the things that matter do not simply vanish. They are still up there, unchanged, in exactly the same positions that the Egyptian priests mapped with such care, exactly as they appeared to the farmers who planted their grain by the light of Sirius, exactly as they appeared to the builders of the pyramids who aligned their monuments to the stars, so that the dead king could sail among them. The story does not end. The story never ends. A moment after we close, breathe. You have come a long way, from the Nun to the stars, from the first breath of creation to the eternal walk of 2 celestial bodies across the winter sky, from a world without shape to a world held together by the force of a love that would not give up. Take a moment to feel where you are, your body in this chair, this cushion, this place, the room around you, the air, the weight of the day that you set down at the beginning, still there at the edges, patient, waiting to be picked back up, but perhaps, just perhaps, a little lighter than before. That is the gift of a story like this one. Not that it makes our problems disappear, not that it solves anything, but that it places our individual lives inside something larger, inside a pattern of loss and recovery, grief and love, death and the green return of grain from dark soil, that has been the human pattern since before we had words for it. Osiris knew this. The priests of Heliopolis knew this. The woman who bought her book of the Dead Scroll and had her name written in it, hoping that the spells would carry her through the gates of the Duat, knew this. We are not the first people to have lost someone. We are not the first people to feel broken, scattered, gathered back together imperfectly. We are not the first people to sit in a quiet room and wonder what any of it means. We are part of a long line, a very long line, and at the head of that line, standing in the hall of 2 truths with his crook and his flail and his steady green gaze, is a king who was also a victim, a judge who was also the judged, a god who was also once a man in a sealed chest in the dark, waiting for love to find him. He found his way out, so can we. Go gently. As we come to the end of this story, remember, history doesn't whisper, it roars. And as long as you keep coming back, we'll make sure its voice is never silenced. Thank you for being here today, fellow historian. The past has more to tell us, and we'll be back to listen. Until then, stay curious, stay hungry for knowledge, and remember, history chose us to remember it. See you on the next one.